Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome back to a weekly episode of Endurance Insights where myself, Coach Mark Cullen, goes over a bunch of different topics around the endurance world that I'm seeing with my athletes or that I'm getting questions on or I'm seeing Instagram reels on. And I just like to talk about my philosophies of working with hundreds of different athletes across triathlon, marathon running, CrossFit, high rocks, you name it. So let's get into it today. So my two topics for today are going to be why I think heart rate training is overrated. And I'm going to finish that with some ways where I do think heart rate can be valuable, but in terms of everyday training, it's not a tool I love to use. And second piece is going to be, now that we're in the depths of winter, some tips for people to make sure that they're not injuring themselves in winter and screwing up their spring running races or their year as a whole. So just wanted to give some tips there of what I'm seeing with athletes and what I've gone through living in the depths of winter in Canada where it's been minus 30 degrees Celsius and how I've still had really good spring races despite sometimes in December, January, February having just some abysmal weather where you couldn't even run outside, or if you were there was no way you were running a speed workout. So let's get into it. First topic today, I know this might be a bit of a hot take in here because people love heart rate training and so many people come to me and are like, hey, my heart rate zones are this, or I'm just noticing my heart rate and all my stuff is doing this. So there's a reason why I think heart rate, especially in your day-to-day training, if you're looking at it, can be an overrated tool. So personally, I like to focus my athletes more on RPE combined with either pace or power. So pace typically on the run, power on the bike. And just talk a little bit about how some of the elite athletes actually use and don't use heart rate and some ways you can really be using it in a positive way. But so I don't like to use it in everyday training for a couple reasons. So first one, heart rate is more of a reactive thing. It's not proactive. So heart rate is responding after work has already happened. So if you're running, say, 1 or 2 minute intervals and you're trying to use heart rate, the heart rate is still ticking up during this time and may not even level off in an interval like that. So pace and power tell you a little bit more what's happening in real time. And this leg matters. Like when you're doing intervals, hills, surges, race starts, things like that, you can't really rely on this heart rate because, yeah, it's still catching up as you go along. Next piece is I don't like heart rate every day because it is influenced by so many non-fitness factors. So this isn't non-fitness per se, but it can play into other aspects of life, but fatigue levels. So you could be super fatigued and your heart rate could be high or low on that day because of that. Same thing with sleep quality. Your heart rate could be higher or lower than usual on that day. Heat and humidity is a huge one. A lot of times your heart rate's going to be higher for the same sort of RPE in that heat and humidity. If you are dehydrated, if you've had a stressful day at work or with family, if you've taken caffeine, typically your heart rate's going to be higher for the same RPE. So these factors can dramatically change heart rate. And if you're sitting there looking at your watch during a bike interval or a run interval or a race and you're trying to make micro changes based off of that, I feel like you're using this tool that might not actually be telling you the whole story, where pace and power combined with RPE, you can use those two in real time to really dial in how you're feeling in that moment. And then also bad heart rate data is very common. So if you're somebody who only uses wrist-based heart rate, I've talked about this many times, but that they are not very accurate, especially if you have at all like a bony wrist, if you're at high heart rates, if you're running out or biking out in the cold weather. These have all been shown that heart rate data can be very inaccurate. Definitely if you're going to be using heart rate, and I'll talk a little bit about how I wear a heart rate monitor. I have the Coros armband. I find that one's nicer than a chest strap, which I find a little bit restricting, but I wear it for every workout because it's still data I want to get. It's just not one I'm looking at within my runs and my intervals. But these chest straps or armbands can slip or lose contact. And again, they're not like directly in your heart. They're getting as much as they can based on the flow that they're seeing within the body. So you can be getting inaccurate data from that. So Yeah, even during speed work, sweat, all of these things can affect it. So if you're making decisions on inaccurate data, then you're maybe missing the puzzle and going too hard or too easy in a run. Just back on that fatigue part, recently I had a runner reach out to me and was like, "Hey, I was running these intervals on the treadmill. I was trying to hit like 5K pace for 3 or 4 minutes on these. They felt hard, but I just couldn't even get my heart rate over threshold." And they're like, "Did I not get the intent of the workout, or did I not get the adaptation?" I'm sitting there going, "No, like you did the effort and the pace with it. Like you got the adaptation. Who cares what your heart rate did on this one? Like it's interesting. It was lower there. It's something to keep an eye on. Maybe you got fitter, or maybe you were just fatigued. Like these are just trends to look at over time instead of if he was in that part trying to force heart rate. Maybe he goes way too hard, blows himself up, gets himself injured, ruins the rest of the week. So just an example there of how like looking at it in a workout can have its limitations. And then another gripe I have is heart rate zones are often way too generic. So a lot of times they're taking like the 220 minus your age, or maybe off a max heart rate. So some of these Garmin zones and stuff are so far off, because they're based on population averages. And you need to remember athletes with the same max heart rate can have very like different anaerobic and aerobic thresholds in there. So for somebody like myself, if I'm maybe looking at a CrossFit athlete, for example, versus myself, I have a much higher aerobic threshold as a percentage of my upper end VO2 there. So I can probably roll higher BPMs and still be in my upper Z2 than maybe somebody who hasn't developed as much aerobically there. But that being said, they might be able to roll at higher heart rates sort of around threshold and sort of VO2 than I can. So just some of those upper and lower boundaries and zones vary widely based on physiology, but learning that RPE scale is so important. So if you're doing like recovery type of stuff, RPE in that like 1 to 3 range, where you're getting more of your aerobic stuff, like that 4 to 5 range where you can go all day, breathing is in control, muscles aren't flooding. As you start to get into more of a tempo zone 3, where you're working, breathing is getting a little bit deeper, you're starting to work here, you're clearly like, you feel that mechanical load coming on in that 6 to 7 sort of range, even threshold getting up there closer to an 8, where you're definitely getting some deeper breathing, but it still feels sustainable for sort of longer periods of 10 to 30 to 60 minutes. And then, yeah, getting into that zone 5 where it's more of a 9 to 10, and you know this isn't sustainable for more than, if you're doing a 5K, like probably 20 minutes type of thing or under. But a lot of times in our day-to-day intervals, we're more doing these at 3 to 6 minute type of intervals. And yeah, your breathing is rapid on this. You feel the lactate accumulating and you need to take those breaks, which is why we break them into intervals. So knowing that RPE scale, like I'm super in tune to the point where I can tell when I cross over that aerobic threshold and go from zone 2 to zone 3. And same thing when I cross over my second threshold, that LT2, and things start to become, oh yeah, my breathing's getting a lot more rapid and I can feel like the lactate accumulating, and I know I only have a certain timeline I can hold this. So learning that RPE is so important. And when you're dialed into that in your races, you're going to get the best out of yourself on that day and not be a slave to the data and not let it inform how you do on the day. Because I've had times where I'm like, okay, I know how this is supposed to feel, but I'm rolling along really fast in this race. Like, let's go for it. Like, keep rolling with it. And I know how to perfectly empty the tank, which is why we do B and C races to make sure that we could get in tune on these and take some risks, and sometimes learn the hard way where you go out a little bit too hard and you're like, oh, I get what that feels like. I need to hold it a little more in check early in my races to build towards perfectly emptying the tank versus going out too hard and blowing up. So I just prefer RPE and pace and power. It just teaches athletes to feel breathing, rhythm, muscular tension. It transfers across weather, terrain, race day conditions, and then it reduces sort of being over-reliant on a single metric. You have RPE as your main one, pace or power, and then heart rate is sort of the third one in there. And then, yeah, it's just a nice pace and power are more objective measures of output. They're not distorted as much by stress, caffeine, fatigue, especially if you have them calibrated. I know with GPS, sometimes if you live in a big city or doing a big city marathon, again, you might not have sort of the best GPS on ones like that, which is again why you need to trust in your RPE, because if your heart rate is elevated and suddenly you are getting bad GPS, what do you have left? Your RPE that you've practiced over many training runs leading into that to know where sort of your limit is there. So in the end, like, racing is about execution and not just compliance to like a random sort of metric that you're using there. So just you race to sort of run the appropriate race in those conditions, hit the right bike power that's sustainable, manage effort when things get hard. And a couple examples: I work with CrossFit athletes, high rocks athletes, marathoners, and triathletes. So CrossFit athletes, for example, you're racing a lot of times inside of a building if it's like a shuttle run, or they've done some of these high rock style ones in there where you have no GPS in there. You have a super high heart rate because you're competing and you've probably taken a bunch of caffeine in there. So what can you trust in? Your RPE. And then same thing with high rocks. You're indoors, high heart rate for the same RPE that you might see in training because you're boosted with caffeine in that race environment. A high heart rate is okay in that. It means you're well rested and tuned and ready to maximize yourself on that day. So again, what do you have? RPE. So you need to be practicing these things in training to know what's sustainable through some certain tune-up workouts or B and C races. Marathon or triathlete, it might be outdoors, but again, you could be running Chicago Marathon or Toronto Marathon where you get terrible GPS in the early parts of the race. And what do you have to rely on if, again, your heart rate is super high or you're not getting accurate data on it or your heart rate monitor dies? RPE. So it's just, I'm going to keep hammering this home. RPE is the king of all this stuff. And when we talk about elites, Eliud Kipchoge was very famous for talking a lot about the rhythm, the breathing, the flow versus these heart rate numbers, or even that much about pace. He would let the pace come. Sure, when he was targeting his sub 2 hour marathon, you need to focus on something like that when you're going after a certain time to make sure you're hitting those along the way. But I can tell you he wasn't a slave to his heart rate monitor. And even that Ethiopia book I was talking about, like, none of these guys are wearing heart rate monitors. Most of them weren't even wearing watches for a lot of their run. What are they running off of? RPE. Even let's use an example like Jakob Ingebrigtsen, the Norwegian runner who's an amazing 1500 5K runner, uses more like lactate for control in sessions combined with some of the pace zones in there. But again, most of his racing is driven by pacing and feel. And then even a cyclist, Matthew Van Der Poel, he trains primarily and races primarily by power and RPE. Just heart rate lags too much to really guide execution on there. So elites, it's not to say they're not wearing heart rate monitors and not looking at the data after, but they're using it as context and not something to control what they have going on in training and racing. So great for post sessions and long-term analysis. So where I do like the use of heart rate is looking at a couple things. So if you are getting accurate heart rate data over time, I like to look at things like efficiency factor. So this is like power or pace divided by heart rate and looking to improve that efficiency factor over time. Especially I like to use it for like long aerobic sort of runs or bikes and see how people are doing in terms of their efficiency factor. So it shows building fitness, especially that zone 2, 3, 4 stuff. If your heart rate versus power or pace is getting better over time, is a higher efficiency factor. So that's a great spot there. I like to look at aerobic decoupling. So what that is looking at how much in a percentage-wise your heart rate is ticking up when you're doing some of these longer Z2, Z3 type of workouts. And especially I love to do this with triathletes where they're doing a 2 to 5 hour long ride, holding it in sort of that middle to upper zone 2, holding that power steady. And let's see if the heart rate sort of stays under that 5% in terms of decoupling. I know I'm getting super fit when I can go out there for a 3-4 hour ride. And as long as I fuel it well, hydrate well, and take care of myself and pace it well without a bunch of surges, if I just pin it at like around, call it 200 watts, and my heart rate stays almost the same the whole time, or sometimes it's even like ticking down a little bit. That can be sometimes because fatigue and dehydration. But for the most part, if you see it just very slightly ticking up over time, you know you're getting a lot fitter in this part. You expect to see a little bit of a tick up there, but seeing that percentage is coming down, where if you're you're ticking up more like a 5, 10, 15% over that time, it's clear that you need to do a little bit more of that aerobic work there. So yeah, some of that large drift you might see because you're over pacing or not fueling or don't have that aerobic durability. So those are 2 times I like to use it in training. But again, even those sessions, like I'm picking a power or RPE number that I'm using for this whole time, and I'm looking at these after. The other one I like to use it for actually is recovery trends. So if you're someone who wears a Garmin watch there, and like I was talking about, it's not accurate when it's cold or high heart rates, but where it can be good is when you are sitting still at night wearing a Garmin and you get resting heart rate values and see how those sort of trend in terms of what's your resting heart rate doing over time or within a week or after certain workouts, and sort of HRV trends that you get from that. So it's useful for guiding overall load and recovery. Again, I don't like to honestly look at them right first thing when I wake up, because then you can kind of psych yourself out that, oh, my workouts clearly aren't going to go well, or they are going to go well. I always want to give myself a chance and see how I feel and warm up and ease into those first couple intervals and see how I feel from there and make adjustments. But then I like to look at them maybe after a workout or later in the day and be like, oh, my resting heart rate was low and my sleep score was high. And I felt really good lately, like my HRV trends. I've noticed that a lot this week. We were traveling a bunch over the Christmas period. I came home, had like 3 or 4 good nights of 8 to 9 hours sleep. My resting heart rate was sitting in like the 45 to 50 range while I was away. Suddenly I had like 3 nights in a row where I'm at 40 to 42 BPM. I'm waking up, I'm feeling like loads of energy, and I've had fantastic workouts because of that, and I'm absorbing it. So just those recovery trends are a great spot to use heart rate. So I think our summary here is RPE is the best because it builds awareness. It can be used everywhere. Pace and power can guide the execution, and I like to use heart rate more to analyze trends and recovery. So hopefully that's helpful. Maybe not everybody's take on it, but just my thoughts on it and how I think a lot of the elite runners use it. So maybe heart rate isn't the first one you want to be looking at. Second section I wanted to talk about today is how to avoid getting injured during winter running. So I know there is tons of you who live in super cold parts where it gets below freezing and it snows, or it's just super cold. So some tips during this time. Don't be afraid to use the treadmill if you need to. It's not you being soft. A lot of times it does allow you to get a key workout in or lower injury risk. The treadmill counts just as much as outdoor running. Sure, it's not going to totally substitute if you're running like a spring marathon. You can't do everything on the treadmill because there's something about getting that sort of muscular fatigue and building those tendons and ligaments and muscles so they know the pounding of a marathon. You need to have some of those key long runs outside to make sure that you are preparing the body for that, or inevitably it's not going to be your system that limits you. It's going to be your legs falling apart. So use the treadmill during the winter. It's totally fine. It counts just as much. You don't have to do extra time on it, things like that. Consistency is going to matter more than toughing it out. So the treadmill provides awesome ways in terms of controlled pacing, really working on form. I've seen lots of people use the treadmill, come outside and be like, wow, I'm noticing like some great changes in my cadence and my rhythm and my form there. And yeah, you just get consistent footing on there, which is super important. But that being said, if you do have to run outside for all of your runs and it's snowy and it's icy, if conditions don't allow for safe executions, there's some ways you can adapt. First of all, it's okay to turn an interval run into a steady aerobic run off of RPE if you need to. I've had fantastic spring running races off of terrible December, January, February weather where I had to skip a bunch of the workouts and just run aerobically or go off of RPE on them and not hit paces. And I still came into March and April and ran some of my best races in there. So turning intervals into steady aerobic work. The other options to make sure you get the quality in is maybe if you're looking at the forecast and there's a terrible Thursday and a nice Wednesday and your workout was planned for the Thursday, maybe you swap the days in there, but just make sure you're not stacking too many intense days in a row. So talk to a coach or an expert if you need any advice on that. And then the other one is obviously swap for a treadmill or an indoor track if you do have the option on one like that. But missing a workout and not trying to make it up is better than forcing a workout in the winter and getting yourself injured. Just especially when you're in winter, like don't force a lot of paces there. Remember, you're wearing 20 pounds of clothing that you're sweating in, so you're carrying extra layers here. It's cold out there. You're breathing in cold air. You just don't get the body warmed up the same way as when it is warmer out there. The ground is super hard, so you're not getting as much of a bounce off there. The wind is often whipping in the winter, so just keep the effort consistent. The pace will fluctuate. It might be slower than if it's on a treadmill or in perfect conditions. The pace will come when it is time and you get the right conditions for it. But forcing summer paces in the winter often increases that injury risk, and you'll get a chance to show off those good paces on the day when you get a little bit nicer weather and you're not wearing 40 layers of clothing. So another piece in this winter running is like take your warm-up seriously. So it could be something as simple as before you even go out to start your run, hop on the bike for 10 or 20 minutes and do an easy spin to get those muscles and that core temperature warmed up. That can go a long way because cold muscles are stiffer and less elastic. So if you're forcing yourself out the door into bad conditions, you could put yourself at risk of injury. But some other simple ways is just like very much easing into the run, extending warm up. So maybe if you're only used to doing a 10-minute warm up, maybe you make it 15 or 20 minutes and shorten the cool down a little bit. Don't be afraid to add some drills before you go outside, some leg swings, some lunges, just some dynamic stretching to get things moving, or you can add that after the warm up. The warm ups don't need to be fancy, but it's just make sure you do something there to give the muscles a little extra warm up than you might get in nicer conditions. Some other things around footwear is like just rule of thumb, if you look at your shoes and they're like bare on the bottom, or you're starting to notice any little niggles that you don't usually get in your ankle or in your knee, just retire those shoes. If you run on them a couple more times, I've seen so many people injure themselves that way. So please retire shoes earlier than later. If you find pairs you like and they're on sale, buy multiple pairs so you have that easy change in there, so you don't have to go to a store or wait for a pair to come online and have to skip runs or force runs in bad shoes. So it's something you will not regret because you just make sure that you don't get injured or you lower your risk exponentially. But making sure you're wearing good footwear in the winter, maybe wearing something that has a little bit more padding and cushioning on it. Just that cold ground is harder and less forgiving than when you maybe are doing some runs on some trails that you might not be able to in the winter, or the track that takes off some of that load. So if you're running on hard concrete or pavement, if you can take the load off when your muscles again are tighter and the ground is harder, that goes a long way to making sure that your legs are getting less beat up. So just some shoes with slightly more cushioning, good grip on them. Don't be afraid to rotate your shoes and just avoid those worn out pairs. So you're just going to lower your risk of bone and tendon stress on that. So just my biggest piece of all of this in the winter is get rid of like the perfection and rigidity mindset. Focus on consistency, keeping yourself healthy. And if you stack a bunch of that solid stuff, I can tell you get this like instant boost in the spring of 10 to 20 seconds per kilometer just from your body being warmed up, you dropping the crazy layers, wearing crappy shoes, things like that. So can't recommend that enough. If you have any questions on these topics, you can always leave a comment on this stuff for future episodes. I can cover more stuff, or send me a message on Instagram if you want to banter about any of this stuff, or if you disagree with any of it. I'm always open to having spirited conversations on this. I'm just basing a lot of this on what I've seen working with athletes, the research I'm doing, studying elite athletes, looking at studies, listening to podcasts, Substacks. I spend hours and hours of this. But hey, this is just my philosophy, and there's tons of people who have had success in other directions, especially on the heart rate side of things. So interested to hear what you have to say. Send me a message if you're curious on any of that. If not, we will see you next week. Best of luck with all your training and racing coming up.